Hey guys, welcome to another Workshop Wednesday, and today we're going to be discussing free wheels, free hubs and cassettes and how to remove them and reinstall them, because knowing which type you've got determines what type of tool you will need, along with another couple of specialist tools alongside them to complete the job. Now, free wheels and cassettes at first glance can look very similar, so it can lead to a little bit of confusion, but hopefully with this video I can try and demystify some of that confusion and get you well on the way to getting the job completed yourself. Also, before we go to the table, I just want to apologise for the hat, but it is actually -3 in Essex today, and my little garage here hasn't had a chance to warm up for me to come in and film this, so that's why I have a hat on inside. Right, let's go over to the table. Okay, so here we have a cassette and freewheel, and as I said earlier, from a first glance they look fairly similar. In fact, from this distance you'd be forgiven for thinking they are exactly the same thing. Now, they do in fact do exactly the same job, it's just that the freewheel is a slightly older technology than the cassette. They both spin and engage the same way, but it's what's happening behind the cassette and freewheel that differentiate the two. So let's start off with the freewheel. So there are a number of different types of freewheels. This is a mountain bike freewheel, and this is a 26-inch wheel that originally came off a very old 90s mountain bike that I did a bit of work on. So this is one type of freewheel, but there are different types. For instance, this is a single speed freewheel, and this is the one that I took off my Fixie and featured in a previous video on how to remove this freewheel. But there are also BMX freewheels, which are largely the same as this, but will have slightly different tooling. Now, that is one common feature of freewheels, in that the different types will have different variations on the tools that are needed. For instance, as you can see with this one here, it has 4 notches, and so therefore the tool you need has the 4 splines on it. However, the one that I put back onto the fixed speed bike only had 2 notches, and so I needed this specialist BMX freewheel removal tool. However, to identify freewheels, most of them will have one thing in common, and that is that the tool marks, when you rotate the freewheel, will not move. So like this one, when I rotate the sprocket, the tool notches stay where they are. Similarly, if you take a close look at this one, if you look at the inside of the freewheel, when I spin the sprockets, the inside of the cogs don't move. Now, there are lots and lots of different tools for different freewheels, and I'm not going to go into all of them because there are far too many to mention. However, this one I have here, although old, has a very standard tool that is required. So the first thing you want to do is remove your axle wheel nut to give yourself access to the inside of the cogs here. Now, the freewheel removal tool that I'll need for this is this Shimano FW30, and I know it's a freewheel removal tool because it says freewheel on it. However, when you look at it, it looks very similar. If you can notice those splines around the edges, it looks very similar to the cassette removal tool. Now, one thing to note is, although they look fairly similar sizes, the cassette removal tool is ever so slightly bigger than the freewheel removal. The splines on a freewheel removal tool are just 0.5mm deep, whereas the ones on a cassette removal tool are 1mm deep. So you'll find, and I'll show you this in a moment, that a freewheel removal tool will work on a cassette, but a cassette removal tool will be too large in diameter to work in a freewheel. And let me show you that in practice. So here we are, here's our freewheel removal tool, and that slots over the axle and very easily, very nicely goes into the tool marks, and I can feel that engaging. So when I now want to get my adjustable spanner on there to twist that out, that will engage nicely. However, if I try to put a cassette removal tool in there, it simply won't fit. Those splines are simply too big to go in, and it's only 0.5mm difference, but that does make all the difference. So as I say, you can get away with using a freewheel removal tool on a cassette, which I'll show you again in a moment, but you can't actually use a cassette removal tool on a freewheel. And on a freewheel, actually the only tool you will really need is this removal tool, as well as some kind of adjustable spanner. You don't need any specialist tools like a chain whip for this, because once the tool is in, when you try to turn it, the freewheel won't turn with it. So once your tool's in, you set your adjustable spanner, and so this freewheel is actually only loosely turned on for the purposes of this video, and it doesn't need too much force to undo it. However, you can find with these that over time, where the back of the freewheel has connected with the threaded section of the hub, they can sometimes fuse together if enough grease hasn't been used, or if the grease has ultimately all been washed out over time. So you may find that you'll have to put this on the floor and use some real force to try and turn this out, but this does turn counterclockwise to come out. It is a standard screw of lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. So if it is tight, don't be scared that you are turning it the wrong way. It is meant to turn counterclockwise, and eventually it will come loose, and then you can remove your tool and take the entire free wheel off. Now, you can see here on the hub, it has this threaded section on it, which accepts the threads on the back of the freewheel. This is what makes it a freewheel, and you'll see in a moment the difference between this and the free hub, which is used by a cassette. Effectively, all of the ratcheting and the pulls and everything that engage to turn the wheel of your bike are all contained within this freewheel. So once you've removed it, you can either clean that up, take it away, put some degreaser on it, or if you're replacing it for a new one, you can get rid of that and then bring your new one in. So putting your now clean freewheel or your brand new freewheel back on is very simple. I would always advise putting some grease around the threads before doing so though, again, just in case you need to take it off at a later date. It just makes it a little bit easier and stops any of that galvanic corrosion. Now, because this tightens in a clockwise fashion, and because that is the way that it engages the pulls as well as you're turning the chain, as you're turning the pedals, you can actually spin this on by hand first of all, and then when it gets to the end you can again use your freewheel removal tool and your adjustable spanner and then just tighten that down. It doesn't need a huge amount of torque on here to tighten this. You want to make sure it's nipped up a certain amount just to make sure that if you start backpedaling that the freewheel isn't going to start loosening itself. But as you're pedaling anyway and the chain is turning this way, you will find that it will self-tighten. So there shouldn't be much of a fear of this turning off backwards. So once you've got your freewheel on, you can put your axle wheel nut back on, and that is ready to go back on your bike. So now moving over to the free hub and cassette, and this is what we're looking at. Now, the first thing you want to do is remove your quick release skewer, or you may also find that you have a similar setup with a solid metal axle going through the middle of the hub like we did on the freewheel. But however your wheel is set up, you want to make sure that you remove any obstructions that stop you getting to the tooling marks. And so now with that out of the way, we can see that when I spin the cassette here, if you keep an eye on these tool marks here, they turn with the cassette. Now, going back to what I was saying with the freewheel, you'll find that if those tool marks don't move, you've almost certainly got a free wheel. If the tool marks do move, it's an indication that you've got a cassette on a free hub. Now, as I also mentioned earlier about the different tools that you can use, if I place the freewheel removal tool into the cassette, you'll notice that it goes in and it engages, and you may well in a pinch be able to get away with taking the cassette off with a freewheel removal tool. I wouldn't suggest it because again, because these splines are so shallow, you may find that the tool slips as you're trying to undo the lock ring here. So it's always best to try and use a cassette removal tool if you can. And I can actually feel that that fits much more snugly than the freewheel removal. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this lock ring will turn with the cassette. So there's no way that I will be able to turn the removal tool on this without somehow holding on to the cassette. Now, you're not going to be able to do this by hand because you'll end up tearing your fingers to shreds. So in this case, this is where your chain whip comes in handy. Now, these are fairly cheap anyway. I got this one in a set with the cassette removal tool, and I also got an 8mm hex key that comes with this handy little square plug that goes into the cassette removal tool. So if you don't have an adjustable spanner to put onto the cassette removal tool here, you can actually just use this hex head in this square plug that goes in here, and that can all be bought for around £5 to £10. So it's really not expensive. However, if you wanted to avoid that and you have some old chain sitting around, what you can do is wrap an old piece of chain around the cassette and then clamp it with, say, a pair of mole grips or something like that, and use that just as easily as a chain whip. However, that can be a little bit sketch at times, so I would always advise using a proper chain whip. And to use this, you simply lay the chain links over the cassette and place the handle at about 2 o'clock, I find is best. Now I've got that held, the cassette won't move and it will allow me to spin this to now release that lock ring. Now again, for the purposes of this video, I've only put this in here hand tight. So you will almost certainly find that this lock ring is done up a lot tighter and you will need to use a lot more force. But once you have released it, again in the standard method of lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, you can spin that all the way out and then you're left with the lock ring on the removal tool. You can then remove your chain whip and then you can start to remove the cassette. Now, different to the Freewheel, which comes off in one complete lump, you may well find that your cassette, like this one, will come off one cog at a time until you get down to a certain level when the rest of the cassette will come off in one, like this. Now, if your cassette has spacers in between some of the gears, and this one doesn't because the spacers are actually built into the back of each of the cogs, but if they do have spacers, then make sure to keep hold of those and keep those in the correct order to make sure that when they go back on, you have the right amount of space in between those gears so that indexing of the gears and changing gears isn't incorrect. So then once you've removed the cassette, you've got free access to the free hub here. Now, this is the difference between cassettes and freewheels. As I mentioned earlier, all of the moving parts for a freewheel are inside the main cluster of gears, whereas the movement on a free hub, which this is done within the hub itself, and then the cassette is just a piece of metal that sits over the top. Now, once you're here, you can actually get into the cup and cone bearings, get into all the ball bearings inside the hub. You can take those out, clean that up and re-grease it, and I will go into that in a future video. But for now, I'm just going to show you how to put a new cassette on, and I have actually got a slightly different cassette to put on to the one I've taken off, and you can see there that only the last 3 gears come in a bundle and the rest of the gears come as separates with spacers. Now, I wanted to do it this way to just give a few more examples of one thing you need to look out for, and that is, and I'll bring it close for this, but as you spin the free hub round, you will notice this one very narrow spline. And then when you look at the cassette, you will notice that there is also a corresponding very thin notch. Now, you need to look out for this because this cassette will not go onto the free hub in any way other than the very narrow spline going into this very narrow notch. That helps all of the cogs go on in the correct orientation, which is important for indexing and shifting. So we have the narrow spline here, and I'm going to match that up with the narrow notch, and that slides on there nicely. And again, that will not slide on there in any other fashion other than with those notches and splines lined up. And then we go ahead with all of our other cogs. And again, they will all have that similar narrow notch there to engage on the narrow spline. Now, this is where your spacers come in handy, but you don't have to worry about how these go on with regard to the narrow spline or a narrow notch. These are universal, so these will just push on in any fashion. And then once you've got each spacer on, you can then put the next cog on. Once that cog's on, again, you go in with another spacer. And the other thing to mention actually is because this narrow spline leaves a larger notch to the side of it, you don't need to worry about putting these cogs on back to front because they will actually only go on one way. So for instance, if I try to put this one on backwards, because the larger spline on the sprocket here doesn't actually line up with the larger notch on the free hub. So these will only go on in one direction, so you've no need to worry about putting them on back to front. And so then once you have your final cog on, you can grab your lock ring, again, place that over the top and gently work out where the thread starts, because what you don't want to do is cross thread it and then start graunching it up with your removal tool to find that you completely strip the threads. But that is on hand tight now, and again we get our removal tool and we can turn that in hand tight. Now we're putting it back on. We don't need to worry about using our chain whip now because we can either use our hex head that we got in our toolkit, or we can use our adjustable spanner to go onto the end of the removal tool here. But once we have that, then we can just tighten that down. Now these should be torqued to a certain specification, and actually on this one it does mention 40 Newton meters. Now I don't actually have a torque wrench that sits in that range. I have one that goes from 0 to about 24, and then one above that goes from 60 to 120. So I don't actually have one that 40 sits within the range of. However, I've never really had a problem with just graunching this down using quite a bit of body weight, and then when you start to hear that click, then you know that you've pretty much tightened that up as much as it needs to be. But then of course the last thing to do, which you can't forget, is to put your quick release skewer back through, and that is ready to go back on your bike. So there you go, one freewheel and one cassette fully removed and reinstalled. As I said earlier, really not a difficult job, but with the freewheel, you just need to make sure that you have the correct freewheel removal tool, and for the cassette, just make sure you have the cassette removal tool and a chain whip. And then an adjustable spanner or the hex head and that square plug really do come in handy. So not expensive at all, so you can buy those and just keep those in your toolkit for future jobs. But yeah, simple as that, guys. I hope that has given you some idea on how to identify the difference between cassettes and freewheels, and identifying which you might have on your bike. So as ever, guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.